Fantastic. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a relaxing and well-timed break. I do need to say, we all miss doing this in person. It would be so fun to be together in one room and sharing the interactions and the learning that we're having today, but only in a virtual environment can a school board member get up during a break and put zucchini bread in the oven. So Adrian Raymond, I know you're out there. I hope that loaf of bread comes out fantastic. And for the rest of you, I will deal with that in my next board meeting. You can rest assured of that. But right now, I'm eager to continue our program with our keynote speaker. The focus is equity is a verb, taking action to ensure equitable school reopenings. And we are joined by Regina M. Jacobs, Esquire. Regina is the Chief Equity and Member Services Officer at the National School Boards Association. Following the keynote and concluding today's program, the NSBA will offer 3 breakout sessions. Login information to access those breakout sessions can be found on your virtual agenda. The first breakout session is called Back to Governing, Identifying and Dismantling Institutional Racism in Education, with Leah Amelga, the Director of Equity and Member Services at the NSBA. The second session is called Back to Teaching, Emotional Readiness of Staff, with our keynote speaker, Regina M. Jacobs. This session has its own link to a Zoom meeting on your virtual agenda. And the third session is Back to Learning, Addressing the Mental Health Needs of Every Student, with Adam Lustig, Director of the Center for Safe Schools at the NSBA. Again, please refer to your virtual agenda for the link to this breakout session on Zoom. It's my honor to welcome today Regina M. Jacobs. Regina currently serves as the Chief Equity and Member Services Officer for the National School Boards Association, where she advocates nationally for educational equity, seeking to identify and eradicate discriminatory practices, prejudices, and beliefs related to race, disability, and socioeconomic status in public education. She regularly provides board development, transition planning, and specialized professional development in a variety of settings. Regina is an accomplished attorney and a skilled negotiator, and has over 25 years in public service working with multiple complex bureaucracies, including pre-K through 12 education school systems, state and national nonprofit organizations, government, quasi-government agencies, and labor unions. Working with diverse stakeholders, she supports group identification of a shared agenda, always seizing opportunities to build respect and trust. In various leadership roles, whether as chair of one of the largest school districts in the United States for almost 6 years, president of the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, or as vice chair of the National School Boards Council of Urban Boards of Education, Jacobs is known for her effectiveness in bringing divergent stakeholders to the table to tackle contentious yet necessary issues with the focus on improving quality of life. Please join me in virtually welcoming Regina M. Jacobs.
Well, thank you so much, David. I appreciate that great welcome. NSBA staff and I, Adam Lustig and Leah Amelga, we're delighted to join you today. And there may be some other NSBA family on the line, so I just want to say that we are here to support you and to delve into these very difficult conversations during this very difficult time in a way to let you know that you're not alone, obviously. But I also want to first take this opportunity to talk about our member, the Vermont School Boards Association. I'm sure you know this because you live in the state, but I just want to let you know from a national perspective that you have great advocates in your state. The School Boards Association is working diligently on your behalf, and also at the table as we were talking about and discussing federal advocacy and the issues that impact what's happening with us in this country right now. So I just wanted to do that. And then I also want to just congratulate them for the joint effort with the Superintendents Association in convening this session. Let's kind of start, before we get to the session objectives, let's kind of start with how we want to ground ourselves in this work. And one of the best ways for me to do that before every session, because it's always kind of nerve-wracking, is to just kind of talk about what brought us here today. And I'll start with what brought me here. So my personal journey to this work has been just that. It's been a journey. So, if I think about when I was in undergraduate, I went to University of Maryland undergraduate, And I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. And I remember saying to my grandfather, who's now deceased, my maternal grandfather, I really want to go to college. I think it's going to be a good thing for me. And I remember him saying, you know, that sounds really like a good idea. But no one in the family really had the information that I needed as a student to say, this is the path that you take. This is everything that you need to do to get there. They were all very supportive. You know, I remember the family just kind of trying to research on their own to help me navigate what I needed to do. But that's part of my personal journey. And I would tell you that on my father's side of the family, my grandparents were sharecroppers. And that's not that long ago. My grandfather died a couple of years ago on my father's side, a few years ago now. And I remember the stories of them working on a farm in North Carolina and what that meant for the future for family and the conversations that were going on about what the children in the family would do and what our next moves would be. And so somehow or another, my parents divorced when I was about 4 or 5. My dad was in Vietnam, and they divorced when I was 4 or 5 years old. My mom and I moved to New Jersey for a brief period. And what I would say to you is that in that journey, at 15, I moved to Maryland with my dad and finished my last year of high school. And there's a reason I'm telling you this journey, because it's when we start to think about what equity means and what it looks like for individual families, is when we start to realize the impact that we can have, especially as governance teams. Boards and superintendents, you don't tap enough into your superpower, and you have it. So I'm hoping that today will also inspire you to really tap into your superpower to change the life for children. And so just kind of coming full circle, I moved here, I ended up in college. I went to the University of Maryland. I remember working at this store called Mary Ann's, and I saved every dime I could get just to pay the admissions application process. And so I get to college. You know, the University of Maryland at the time, you're talking 33,000 students, not very many students of color, not very many Black students. And so that alone was a journey for me. In my elementary and high school experiences, oftentimes I was the only or very few children of color in my classroom or in my school. So I had different experiences that I can share with you. But having said that, so I get here and I graduate from college, and I apply for this job, and I'm thinking it's the best thing because I studied criminology in undergraduate in behavioral and social sciences. And a friend of mine sends me this announcement, and he says, "Oh, you're going to love this job. It's your passion. You want to change the world." Well, little did I know that the job that I actually had applied for was a uniformed corrections officer. And so 23 years later, I did stay in that job. I was actually a correctional officer in the Department of Corrections in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is the second largest county in the state of Maryland. And that journey was interesting in and of itself. Like, we could do another whole session about that. But then somewhere along the way, I just had a passion to go to law school, and I guess the best way to say is I had gained a godfather in my college years, who was very supportive of me when I was going through undergraduate and law school. As a matter of fact, he's the one that really catapulted me into my law school experience. So working the midnight shift in the Department of Corrections full time, I went to law school during the day full time and survived it. And somewhere along the way, while I was working in corrections and at the same time had my own little private law practice that I was kind of doing on the side, somewhere along the way, the school district needed attorneys to review their cases of expulsions and suspensions. I was one of 3 attorneys that was hired to do that work. So I was a hearing examiner for the school district. And so as a hearing examiner for the school district, I got to see sort of, if you can imagine, this picture of, I work in the Department of Corrections, I'm now an attorney supporting the school district and looking at suspensions and expulsions, and I'm seeing this sort of connection. Not to mention, by the way, that the jail and the school board office were about 3 miles away. So if you can imagine a school to prison pipeline experience in that, I'll share a lot about what I mean by that as we continue this conversation. And then in our county, we had the opportunity at one time, our state legislature had created an all-appointed board, and so citizens did not have their right to vote in the county for the school board member. And in 2006, it was the most important election in the state. And citizens were just in an uproar. They wanted to vote for their school board member. They were making demands about what education should look like. They talked about the inequities, etc. But let me just pause to tell you what Prince George's County is like. Prince George's County, Maryland, is considered one of the, if not the wealthiest county in the country for Black people who are either middle and upper middle class and also highly educated. So this whole conversation and question around equity in that environment was very different. But I was seeing it in a different way because I was working in corrections and at the same time seeing what was happening to children. And so I bring this background to you because I hope that it'll help you to understand kind of the focus of this session today. And so I, in 2006, ran for the school board and was successful and served and survived 10 years on the school board. And more to come with that conversation. Right now, I'm going to delve into our session objectives and hopefully get us started with really what we're talking about today. So we're really talking about gaining an understanding and also evaluating gaps that are resulting from the shift to distance learning. We're talking about reopening to new normals, the conversation around equity versus equality, and governing towards a more equitable normal. And the reality is, as we start to think about those session objectives, the undergirding or the foundation, if you will, all comes back to a conversation around equity. Thanks, Adam. And so when we have a conversation about equity, it's also, it's important to talk about what are some of the norms for equity discussions. And so these are taken from Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race. They can apply to courageous conversations almost about anything. But essentially, if we were in a face-to-face conversation, we would have opportunity to sort of speak your truth, if you will. But these are things that I would like for you to think about as we have this conversation. And that is speaking your truth, staying engaged, even when it's difficult. Expect to experience discomfort at some level and persist anyway. Oftentimes in these conversations, you know, you might feel that tap in your foot. You know, it's like, okay, somebody's stepping on my toes. Or you might feel some sense of defensiveness. And this doesn't, by the way, only apply to a certain group of people. Being aware of intent and owning your own impact. So the way that we describe things or the way that we talk about things, we don't get to choose how they land on people. But if we're aware of our intent, it makes it easier. Expect non-closure. These conversations won't happen or won't end in complete outcomes, if you will, at the end of this hour-and-a-half session. And then maintain a learner stance. Next slide, Adam, and remain open to new thinking. So as we think about that, our Center for Public Education has really done some research around these main drivers of equity. And they are funding high-level curriculum, effective educators, safe and supportive school climate, and meaningful community engagement. Now, what you're going to see, I'm going to go through some of these, but what you'll see in the breakout sessions is that Adam will delve deeper into the safe and supportive school climate piece of it, and Leah will talk about overall governance in these 5 areas. So when you think about funding, it's about who is receiving the funding. Is it equal between buildings, or is it equitable based on needs? The easiest example I tend to give around these conversations is we all have on shoes today. Well, we're home a lot, so we may not, but we all tend to have, we have on shoes. The question is, do they all fit? Equal means we get the same thing. Equity means we get what we need and we get what fits for us. If we think about the opportunity and access to high-level curriculum, what we're talking about is who has access to rigorous coursework and how is it determined? How do we decide what happens with students? When I got on the school board in this wealthy county in Prince George's County, Maryland, you had to live in a certain zip code to get even have access or option for an AP class, for example. So by the way, one of the things I missed by saying, once I described this sort of middle class, upper middle class, wealthy community, is that our school district, 70% of the students are eligible for free or reduced meals, and sometimes much higher than that. So that's the conversation around equity that I think resonates when we are talking about that. The other thing is effective educators. I think what you'll see in some of the data that we're going to talk about today is exactly what I mean here, and that's who has access to the most effective teachers and the most experienced teachers, like where are they placed. In our school district, which by the way, Prince George's County is larger than the state of Vermont. I learned that really quickly when I was campaigning across the county and realized it was huge. I ran at large, so I had a huge area to cover. But one of the things that's really important when we think about that is we were paying $30 million for enhancements for teachers to get their master's degree. And what we discovered, that and National Board Certified Teachers always get an enhancement as well. One of the things that we discovered was that we were not making a connection between those effective teachers and outcomes for students. So that's the conversation around effective educators. And then safe and supportive school climate is really, what are the key factors that are ensuring safe and supportive environments for students? And in this session and in the sessions coming up, you're going to hear us talk a lot about what discipline means and what that looks like across, not just in Vermont, but across the country when it comes to safe and supportive school environment. And of course, it covers a huge spectrum. But we know victory can't happen if children aren't in the classroom. So we're going to talk about that. And then the community engagement piece is really an area that I think boards all too often, you can go to the next slide, Adam, all too often forget. This is the advocacy role that you play. And this is again, this is sort of that area of your superpower that you can really navigate in a better way to across the country, I mean, to help the community understand the nuances of public education. We were having a discussion just today with the executive team around the fact that if we look at news coverage, right now, there's the voice of teachers, there's a voice of even superintendents, there's a voice of parents even, and where's the school board voice? Like there's so much that's missing in these conversations. But that brings me to, we talk about these main drivers and factors around equity, but what is it? What exactly is equity? So the NSBA Board of Directors for the first time embarked upon this journey as well, if you will. You know, our mission has kind of always had the terms equity and excellence in education. But we've never really defined it, I don't think, in a way that raises the level. What's the vision for it as a national level to support our states? And so I'll read it to you. Okay, can you all hear me okay? I'm getting a message that I have some difficulties. We affirm in our actions that each student can, will, and shall learn. We recognize that based on factors including but not limited to differing abilities, race, ethnicity, and social economic status, that students are deprived of equitable educational opportunities. And educational equity is the intentional allocation of resources, instruction, and opportunities according to need, requiring that these practices, discriminatory practices, prejudice, and beliefs be identified and eradicated. And this is the Board of Directors in 2017, next slide, Adam, voted on this as a board and then elevated this conversation around equity. And so as we think about what that means, the real question here is, what is the role of school board in ensuring equity in the district? So one thing that you'll notice from our conversations and the facilitations that we do, there's a lot of conversation at the state association level, at the NSBA level, that speaks to sort of what's the board's role, what's the superintendent's role, and a lot of that conversation tends to be, you know, everybody stay in their lanes and everything will be okay. Well, we try to shift that conversation to, that's true, but also what does a governance team look like? What is the role of a governance team? So, but for here, the role of a superintendent is to ensure in ensuring equity in a district. Your main functions are usually hiring the superintendent, setting policy, and approving the budget. And so when we think about those factors that I just mentioned, the question becomes, how are you hiring your superintendent? What are you looking for? What are the right questions that you're asking when your state association, for example, is helping you to navigate that conversation or navigate that process, what should the board be looking at in that regard? What policies are you not only setting, but what policies are currently on the books that may be creating or causing inequities in the district? And remember that policies are never neutral. And then when you're approving the budget, I just gave you an example of the conversations that we were having in Prince George's County about, how are we allocating resources? So the allocation of resources must be intentional. And that is why, next slide, Adam, when we think about leadership accountability and the community engagement piece, that is why it's critically important to look at what role the board plays and how are they allocating those resources. So let's jump right into Vermont. I have to give you a very quick, brief story. My godfather, who happens to be in his 90s now and retired in New Mexico, is the person who supported me significantly in my journey to get into law school and to fund law school. And I remember applying to all these different places that I had never been. Remember, I didn't grow up in North Carolina. I was born in North Carolina. We moved to New Jersey at a very young age, but my family were all from North Carolina. So I had that Southern experience, if you will. But I was thinking about moving further north, let me just check out New England, or let's go to Vermont or somewhere that I've never been before and barely heard of growing up. And my godfather, who happened to be Jewish, said to me, you probably don't want to do that. I'm not sure you'll be comfortable. And he gave me all these, he never really mentioned race, to be honest with you. He just said, you may not be as comfortable in that environment as you are in your current environment. So, needless to say, I ended up going to law school in the District of Columbia, which was close to home at the time. And so let's talk about Vermont, though. Your 2020 population number says that there are about 628,000 residents who live in Vermont. 93% are white, 2% are Hispanic, almost 2% are Native American, and 1.2% are Black or African American. And that number in another data point actually says 2, so it's not that much different. Adam? And to the participants, Adam is helping me a lot with the slides. So as I was thinking about the experiences of our school board association and how they navigate the state, I saw all these beautiful pictures of Vermont, and I thought, wow, seeing them at conferences as opposed to then, this is kind of what they come back home to. My first thought was, in DC, we have tons of traffic, and in the Washington metro area, I thought how serene and how beautiful your state is. So thanks for letting me experience that virtually. Next slide, Adam. So let's just kind of start with what your legal aid, a legal aid report, in Vermont. And I went back to this one in 2011-12. And one of the first things they said was that that the first provision of Vermont's education law guarantees each student substantially equal access to a quality basic education, substantially equal. And so I try to navigate that with equity, and substantially equal pretty much means that students will get what they need to be successful. And one of the things that I pointed out also in this is that they need to be able to succeed in a global market. Oftentimes when we're talking about equity, and what I would say to you, Vermont, is that although your state is 90+% white, we tend to prepare our students, right, for the global world. We prepare them to leave Vermont, come back to Vermont, but be able to experience life outside of the state that they live in. When I taught at the University of Maryland for 15 years, probably a piece that I left out of my journey, I had students who had never seen a Black person when I taught on a military base, for example, until they came to the military. And so the experiences that we talk about with our children really has to be not just where they live, but where they can go. And we often talk about that when we're thinking about opening the minds of our community and our children. And so A conclusion, though, that was drawn in this report was that many students are not able to share in the benefits of that vision because they're excluded from public and independent schools for typical childhood behaviors. And we're going to talk more about that, Adam, as you go to the next slide. So again, let's just kind of walk through some of your data points, your socioeconomics and your, I'm doing a time check, and your median household income. The median household income in 2017 was $57,000. In 2018, about 60. And one other fact, though, that stands out, when you look at income, usually depending on the state, obviously, you look at how does that income spread across all races, across all economic categories. And so from that perspective, Vermont is second to Maine, is the least racially and ethnically diverse state in the nation. That impacts how your income is calculated. Next slide, Adam. And so if we look at the poverty rate in Vermont, again, I'm sure I'm telling you a lot of data points that you already know, but I just want to sort of ground us in the work. The poverty rate is at 11.3%, and that's about 68,000 of your residents who live in poverty. And then looking at the unemployment rate, January 2020 was 2.4, and no surprise across the country, it's at about 9.4, as we know, due to the pandemic. Next slide. And your health. So this was really intriguing for me because I think about, when you think about the conversations that people have about where do you want to raise your children, or where do you want to live, and what are the things you think you want to do on vacation, etc. Vermont is considered one of the healthiest states in the nation. Congratulations to you for that. But one of the things that was pointed out in so my understanding from researching and doing this work was that the Healthy Vermonters 2020 as started this work in 2010, and then ended up with just kind of trying to look at what your health would be like in a decade. But some of the really most popular health related topics were obviously the coronavirus. And then some others that really stood out to me was around preventing alcohol and substance abuse. And next slide, Adam. And what you'll see as we talk more and more about the conversation around your health is that mental health is also critically important. So states with a high rate of, typically states that have a high rate of access to health care, Okay. States with a high rate of access to health care tend to have a low prevalence of mental illness, but Vermont, for some reason, is the opposite. The state has a high incidence of mental health conditions, but also have a high rate of access. And so that goes to a lot of factors, your socioeconomic status, et cetera. One of the things, however, that was really critically important is that Vermont has a growing rate of suicide. Next slide, Adam. Okay, so let's talk about your crime stats. In 2011, if you think about what's going on in the rest of the country, comparatively, your crime rate is considered low. So in 2011, there were 16,000 crimes reported with 11 murders, and in 2014, 10,000 with 10 murders. And as we think about violent crime in Vermont, it's about 1.7 incidents per 1,000 people, which is 2 points below the national average. In the past 3 years, however, Adam, you can go to the next slide, the drug deaths increased, which also coincides with another data point, by 52%. So this is where sort of my background really kind of flows in, and that is the prison population and what that looks like in Vermont. So you're a small state. Vermont is a small state, but your rate of imprisonment is higher than that of most countries. And the examples that are given in this report are Brazil, Turkey, and Iran. And the prison population, it has declined. There's been some decline in prison populations across the country, so that sort of national component is also existent in Vermont, but it did triple, has tripled since the 1980s. That could be a number of reasons, growth, et cetera. So I want you to think about the numbers of residents who live in Vermont. And so if you look at Hispanic, Black, and American Indian, Alaska Native residents, they make up almost about close to 10%, not quite 10% of your population. And so while you're a majority white state, you have the highest incarceration rate for Black men in the entire country. And of course, those numbers are based on proportionality, they're based on per 100,000 residents, all those kinds of things. The point here is that you have a high rate of incarceration for Black men. And that while only 1%, 1.4%, as I said, in some data points, that's as high as 2, is the Black population, they account for 8.5% of the prison population. And so there are questions that come out of, next slide, Adam, there are questions that come out of that dynamic that causes us to think about what does that mean, or how does that play into the conversation about equity and about education. So the Prison Policy Initiative, you probably know, they sort of do data across the country and look at incarceration rates and what the level of charges are. And keep in mind, there's a data point that speaks to the violence rate in Vermont is low. And so if we're thinking about why people are incarcerated and what the reasons are for their sentences in Vermont, it raises a question about how are we incarcerating our citizens? And by the way, by the year 2001, the United States was incarcerating more of its own citizens than any other country, including Russia. So essentially, this data point just says the same thing, that you lock up a higher percentage of your people, next slide, Adam, than many do in wealthy democracies. But having said that, all in all, Vermont is a jewel state, small but precious. And that's a quote that I pulled from Ms. Pearl, who talks about just the vast beauty and the preciousness of your environment in Vermont. So I want you to think about how precious your state is and think about all the great things that comes out of Vermont as you think about, next slide, Adam, as you think about this question. And as you think about how are the children, part of our work in equity shifts us from a conversation about all children to a conversation about each child. And there's a tribe in Africa that when they greet each other with, and how are the children? And they don't ask, how are you today? They don't ask, what do you have going on today, or how your day is. But rather they ask about the next generation. And they ask that question because they believe that monitoring the well-being of their children is the best way to determine the future health and prosperity of their whole society. And so as we ask the question today about how are the children, what we ask Vermont is, what is your role in this country and in society for ensuring that the children are well? Because that's the answer that we want to get back from that question. How are the children? The reaction and the response is the children are well. And so Vermont, as we think about that, and again, I keep saying this, as we think about your superpower as governance teams, as people in education, as this great equalizer, what role will you play in ensuring that every single child in your state is supported and able to sort of live this dream that we all have in the promise of public education? Next slide. So we're going to do a quick walk through your equity report card. So this is where school board members, I'll sort of delve in for a minute and say, our sort of kindred spirit is to ask our superintendents for the data. And we want to make data-driven decisions, and we want to be informed about the policies that we put forth, and we want to make sure that we know that the work that we're doing has an impact on children. And as we think about, next slide, Adam, as we think about this equity report card, I want to take a moment and ask you to think about your journey to the school board when you made that decision that you wanted to be on the school board. What was what drove that decision? What were you thinking about? Were you thinking about your own children? Were you thinking about children that you knew? Were you thinking about this sort of this promise of what public education means for children? And so think about that as we navigate through this equity report card, if you will. So school funding, next slide, Adam. School funding, the key that you're going to always hear us talk about here is the intentional allocation of resources. And by all accounts, okay, the United States spends about $12,300 per student on average. And you are spending $19,000, almost $20,000 per student. And so as we think about that, number one, good for you. Some states have funding formulas, some states do not. Some states rely heavily on the state, some rely more heavily on their local counties, etc. All in all, by all accounts, I'm sure school board members, I'm going to be careful as I say this because you always need more funds, right? But by all accounts, the funding levels that you're providing for your students are much higher than what the average place is in the United States. Next slide, Adam. The key question, though, is where's the money going? If you look at per pupil instruction and on student support services, you know, across the spectrum here again, you're outspending the United States. It makes sense around student support, instructional staff, etc. You're outspending the country in public education. Next slide, Adam. So here's an area that you're going to see show up probably twice in this presentation to make a different point. But if you look at how you're spending your money around teacher salaries, it goes back to this conversation that I had earlier with you about how we were expending funds for teachers get their to either get their master's degree or national board certification. So what you'll notice here from an equity perspective is that your highest poverty schools versus your low poverty schools, the teachers who make the most money with the highest salary are in the lower poverty schools. Again, a question about intentional allocation that, and there's a lot that goes into that. We could do a whole session on what that means. But we know that data tells us that students of color and students in poverty are more likely to have an inexperienced teacher and more likely to have teachers who don't have the supports that they need to be successful in the classroom, and that plays out in outcomes for students. Next slide, Adam. And so looking at student achievement, next slide, your data is, you have 88,000 students, next slide, Adam, 88,000 students in your state, and your student-teacher ratio is pretty low, it's pretty good. You have 8,300 teachers, next slide, Adam, and again, you're spending about $20,000 per student. When you look at nationally how your data stacks up, 4th grade reading and in 8th grade math, you're again outperforming the nation. But let's just be clear, you're at 37% in 4th grade reading and 38% in 8th grade math. And the question we have to ask nationally is, we're not even at 50%. So there's something going on in our country as a whole that needs to be a different conversation. Next slide, Adam. And so if you look at, again, this is just a data point about how students score, if they score 3 or 4 on the college readiness exam, and across the spectrum, you can see the differences in how Black students, American Indian and Hispanic students, and even white students and Asian students perform. And that doesn't even address whether the students who are of color and in poverty have access to these classes. This opportunity. Next slide, Adam. In my district, again, as I remember saying to you that even though the county itself was wealthy, the school district, most of our students were eligible for free and reduced meals. And we had the opportunity in terms of intentional allocation of resources where we paid for that, paid for those AP exams, because it's one thing to take an AP class and then it's another thing to have access to the exam itself. But here's a really key slide that I want you to hone in on as we ask the question, how are the children? So if you think about all of the data that suggests that you're outperforming the country in many data points, the question we have to ask is, how is the least among us doing? And then what is the board's role in ensuring that the least among us, if you will, in terms of resources, are able to also be successful? So if you look at those who are eligible for National School Lunch Program, only 21% are at or above proficiency in Vermont. If you look at our students with differing abilities, again, only 10% are at or above proficient in 8th grade reading. So these data points is what really drives the conversation about equity. These data points are the questions that school board members need to ask when they're looking at how are the children. Because one of the things that I've noticed is as we, you heard at the beginning, the team just kind of travels the country, and we give kudos to states that are doing well and districts that are doing well. And one of the things that happens when districts are doing well allows you in some ways to not see those who aren't doing so well because the numbers are so low. And so congratulations on 80%. Our question is, where are the 20%? Next slide, Adam. So as we think about how are the children, we have to think about what does educational equity mean for not all children, but each child. And so next slide, if we start to look at access to high quality teachers, again, now this is no secret. Across the country, there are 97%. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, David. I'm teaching a class. I don't know. I'm sorry. The journey of virtual classes. So if we think about, so 97% of teachers in Vermont are white and 81% across the country. And the questions that we raise about that is not so much a question, but it is, how do we prepare a nation that's predominantly white teachers to understand the cultural competencies, or if you will, or the cultural differences in students who may not look like them, who may not have the same experiences as them. And so as we think about that, as we think about what that means, it means that we're in the 6th year where more than half of America's public school children are of color, and many of those are living in poverty. So again, what is the equity question when it comes to that? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the section about, or the breakout about teachers and preparing them emotionally, because teachers also have the responsibility and the opportunity, if you will, to be culturally competent so that we can understand the students who are walking in our buildings every day. Next slide, Adam. Okay, so that brings me back again to the same slide, that if we look at the teachers in Vermont, you see the sort of average salary is $60,000. But where are we placing teachers? Where are teachers best served, if you will? Next slide. So the lack of teacher diversity in Vermont is obvious. And as I said earlier, it's no different than what's happening across the country. But what's important about that slide, this slide, is that when students, I was trying to remember when I talked to some of my friends and colleagues, you may not ever this may not ever cross your mind, but to have a conversation with a colleague or a friend or someone who says, you know what grade was I in when I had my first Black teacher? Or what grade was I in when I had my first Hispanic teacher? What grade was I in when I had my first Native American teacher? That might not be something that crosses your mind in Vermont necessarily. It may not rise to the level of, why is that important? Next slide, Adam. And so if we look at some of the data that speaks to why teacher diversity is important, there's a lot of research that speaks to, if a Black child, for example, or Hispanic child, or a Native American child have one teacher, just one teacher that looks like them, the the probability of dropping out, the probability of being more successful goes way up. Dropping out goes way down. Being successful goes way up. And so, but let's just be clear, the suggestion is not just that that students of color benefit from teachers of color, so do white students. And the research suggests that white students show improvement around problem solving, critical thinking. And why do you think that is? It's because a teacher who doesn't look like them can also bring a different perspective to an argument or to a theory or to an experience that they may not otherwise have access to. Next slide, Adam. School climate. School climate. Okay, next slide. As we think about school climate and what that means, I'll go back to our findings around, what I said about victory being in the classroom. It can't happen if they're not there. So Vermont Legal Aid, Working for Justice, had some key findings. I think you're going to see a little bit more of this in, I think, Leah's presentation, and she'll also address some of the recommendations that came out of it. But essentially, when we look at school suspensions, your students were suspended in the 2011-12 school year more than 8,000 days. Students with differing abilities are 3 times more likely to be suspended. And then the same group of students, Black and African American, Black and Native American students were actually also 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students. Oftentimes when we do presentations like this, the question is, well, why is that? Well, if you look at the data tells us that we're talking about I hate to use the word offenses, but sort of for the same behaviors, Black students, Native American students are more likely to be suspended than a white student doing the same thing. And then there's this use of exclusionary discipline. So the referrals to law enforcement are higher among students of color and students in poverty, by the way. I did a session in Missouri, which is also a state that most of the school board members, well, across the country, most school board members don't look like students in their communities. But one of the things that stood out was, what about that poor white child whose last name is Jacobs, and everybody knows that's a family that's in poverty. So it's sort of those unconscious and implicit biases that also come with how we all work, who we are as human beings. And so those are things that raise the question, again, how are the children? And helps us to navigate why, getting to the root cause analysis of a lot of these questions. Next slide, Adam. So as we think about what that means, and this slide just shows a breakdown of what some of those actions are in Vermont. And if you look at this other category, for example, those are those sort of insubordination cases or insubordination situations. The student may not have, it's run the gamut in my work. I've seen, policies where teacher says, put your hands on your desk, student doesn't do it, that's a suspension. Unfortunately, there are our codes of student conduct across the country, in some instances, go back to what I said earlier about policies not being neutral. Many of them have not been reviewed. Many of them have not been evaluated to look at disproportionality and how they're being implemented. Next slide, Adam. So as we think about this whole conversation around discipline and what it means, I bring up this sort of notion of restorative justice practices that, is not a perfect science, but it's one that looks at how do we build relationships with students in a different way, and how do we provide alternatives to students in a different way. And so, one side of this conversation is about, what does insubordination mean? And then the other side is, okay, it's a legitimate, offense, if you will, in the student code of conduct, but how are we treating those offenses, if you will? And so I'll tell you that in my work in corrections, we had a juvenile unit. I was in an adult facility, and we had juveniles charged as adults. And when I was in law school, I had the opportunity to work the midnight shift. And so I had this chance to look at, it was kind of interesting. I created my own sort of non-scientific study, if you will. It was interesting to see how people sort of started their career, if you will, incarcerated. And that correlation between students being expelled from school, which I wouldn't have had access to that data, as you know, but then seeing now children charged as adults in our facility, there was that connection between what happened when they were expelled from school, because now children aren't in the classroom and they're left to whatever devices society has for them. So it was a path, if you will. It was a pipeline. And so restorative justice practices, next slide, Adam, are designed to help us navigate those situations with children and let them be children, for example, without leading them down that path, if you will. And so it speaks to restorative justice circles, for example, in schools, really speaks to techniques that talks about restoring relationships. It's about building relationships with students. So the teacher who might say, I think this child looked at me in a menacing way, might actually say, how do I connect with this child and have an understanding about what he or she might have experienced at home, what might have happened to them in their own communities, and how does that play out in child behaviors. And so when a conflict arises, it helps us from an equity perspective navigate what's in the interest of the child, how is the child doing, as opposed to what's the adult reaction to it. And so they're beneficial for youth in learning themselves. It's also about building resilience. It helps children to negotiate conflict themselves, and how do they learn self-expression. And a lot of this also gets to social emotional learning, which you might get some of that as well in Adam's session. Next slide, Adam. So as we think about our next sort of chapter, if you will, in school closures and the widening gaps around COVID-19. Now, by all accounts, next slide, Adam, it looks like, based on at least the brief research that I did and some of the news coverage that's going on in Vermont, that your state seems to feel like it's prepared, or at least more so prepared than others to have face-to-face learning. But we'll see about that. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm just going to kind of walk through this process. So, but what are some of the, as we think about these widening gaps and reopenings, what are some of the effects of school closures that we're concerned about? Well, trauma. Trauma comes in many forms. When we think about trauma and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, it impacts students and staff. The social isolation that has occurred to all of us. And then definitely for students, you know, how many of you as school board members and superintendents and educators have been asking this question, oh my God, how's my child, how's my student that I know has struggled with X, how is she doing? And what are the special education supports that have been provided or not provided during this time? So the effects are huge, the effects are lasting, not to mention the economic circumstances that many families have found themselves in. Next slide, Adam. And so as we think about that, again, coming back to, but what are the opportunity and access gaps that exist? Now, in your state, I read a lot about the digital divide, which again is not unique to Vermont, but it is more likely to be an issue in rural states and rural areas than it will be in other metropolitan areas like the Washington, D.C. area where we are. But even in that, remember that large county I told you that I ran for the school board and survived 10 years. Even in my county, which is rural, urban, and suburban, in certain parts of the county, we have the exact same disadvantages and lack of access that would occur in rural areas just in the county alone. So mental health services and meal services. And one report just recently, this week, today's Tuesday, but talked about the fact that when schools reopen, the families that will not have access, if you will, to free meals, right? So we go back to these lunch programs and cheese sandwiches and things like that for lack of food shaming. I don't know. It's just all these kinds of things that occur and has occurred that will still either reinvigorate when schools open, unless, of course, boards use their superpower and think about all these things equitably. Next slide, Adam. And so as we do that, I certainly want to make sure I leave time for questions. So let me think about, if we look at the some of the research already, again, no secret to you, has predicted that there's a lot of learning loss during this period that doesn't even compare to what summer learning loss data would tell us in any given time. And so, and then in my district as well, across the country, we've seen it too, even in districts where they had some internet access. I know there were school districts where parents could drive to the school, or school buses would park in certain parts of the community so students can get access to internet. What about the students who aren't logging in? Again, that's another segment that deserves a conversation, and how we, feed into what does equity look like in that situation. And so students in some cases will struggle. If you struggled in school, you're going to struggle more with online learning. There's also some data that suggests that some students who learn in different ways, this might be a good thing for them. But what's important about this data point, I believe, is that not just in terms of the research where students who struggle, it's really also about what supports they either lack or can't get access to. And how do you do that in a virtual environment and in the in distance learning? Academic gaps will be harder to bridge. Let's just be real. Families who were pre-pandemic able to provide supports for their students and their children, they're least likely to have the same struggles that we're talking about in these data points, not to mention the social, emotional, and mental health needs of students altogether. What does that look like, particularly in communities of poverty? Next slide. So this isn't an actual survey, but it's something I want you to think about as we kind of shift into the latter part of this presentation, and that is what concerns you most about school openings. And as you think about it, is it health concerns? Is it things that are you worried about? Are you worried about risks for staff and students? Are you thinking about having to if you open fully, will you have to reclose because of what is predicted to be another outbreak potentially in the country? And then, what increased budget costs? We're talking about intentional allocation of resources. What does that look like in this environment? So just things that I know boards and superintendents and the education community is thinking about. So as you think about those concerns, again, this equity conversation has to be forefront in your mind. Next slide. So these are just some areas of conversation that I pulled from your, what was said in April, and then next slide, Adam, where you are today in July, and those kinds of things. The FCC report really supports the data that we've talked about around, lack of access to internet, lack of access to broadband, et cetera. Next slide, Adam. And again, Economic Policy Institute as well talks about low-income households. And if you think about it, when you measure by race and ethnicity, the gap is greater for Black and Hispanic families. Adam, next slide. Okay, and this is where this is just a few days ago, and I quote, "Given our current positive trends, we also need to aim for and plan for school openings. Because if our data shows we can do it safely, it's the very best option for our children, for our kids." And so, and your health commissioner seems to agree with that statement. Again, boards, you have the superpower to make decisions about what that means internally for schools and for each child. Adam, next slide. So reopening to new normals. Next slide. It can mean a number of things. It could be a hybrid approach. It could be in-person learning, repurposing the use of schools. Schools, I think someone said that one of the teachers union presidents in Florida said it best, and that was that schools were built for interaction, not social distancing. And so, of course, smaller districts, smaller states may have a better opportunity to create the sort of social distancing opportunities that are necessary during the pandemic. Next slide, Adam. And so this is kind of the unconventional new normal that occurred back in March, April, that sort of sent us all into this frenzy and what that means. And for some, the question that I would still pose to school boards is that if you go back fully, in person, there may be some families that need a different option. How will boards engage and use their advocacy role in that conversation? Next slide, Adam. And so the challenges, the governance challenges around reopening are really high, but there are also opportunities. When we think about funding, what are the opportunities to refocus priorities? Student-based budgeting. I remember when my district went to a student-based budgeting process, it was really tough, but we did it, and over the years had to, make a lot of adjustments, but it was an opportunity presented. And this conversation about high-level curriculum, opportunity to look more at cultural responsiveness, and for educators, developing emotional mental health supports for teachers, and of course, reframing how school safety looks. What does it look like when we talk about the whole child as an inclusive part of the school culture? Next slide. So this video, I'm not sure if it's going to actually work, and we are short on time, but I want to just sort of maybe give you this first, let's see if it'll work first. Someone will have to send me either a text message or something to say whether or not our attendees can hear it. Okay, I can't hear it, so I'm going to assume no one else can hear it. But here's what I would like for you to do. When you get a moment, this video will be available in the breakout, in the session that your state association will provide to you. Take a moment and look at it. It tells a story of children, quite frankly, and their experiences in Vermont and in the public schools. And it tells a story that school board members must know in order to ensure equity and equitable outcomes. I'm going to stop here to allow for some questions. I think we have about 15 minutes or so. But as we're looking at questions, or if there's something that that's coming that you can send to me, I'm happy to answer those. But as we're looking at whether or not there are questions, here's what I would say to boards. So this conversation about equity is not about blame and guilt. It really is about the capacity that we have to change a child's life, no matter their background, their zip code, who their parents are, who their families are. And the reality is we spend a lot of time, children spend a lot of time in schools. They spend an inordinate amount of time in schools. And to the extent that school impact matters for outcomes for students, it should be one of the best experiences that they have. And that means that we have to break down and dismantle. The school board, the national board approved a DIRE initiative, which we are happy to work with our state associations with, and it's called Dismantling Institutional Racism in Education. And no matter where you live, it exists. The experiences may be different depending on how you grew up, but take it from a person of color who grew up in sort of portions of the South and in the North. In New Jersey, I was in New Jersey for a while, and then ended up graduating from high school in Maryland. So the experiences are different for each child, but it's the board's responsibility and the superintendent's responsibility as governance teams to remember how you decided to go into this work and what it means. And that work from the governance level and from a visionary perspective has to trickle down to the culture of the organization. Students in a classroom, which you'll see in the video when you get to see it, students in a classroom being very open to talk about, in a negative way, Black students, Hispanic students, or Native American students, means that that's a culture that they're used to, that they're okay with those conversations. So I don't know if we have any questions, but I will say to you that I am, again, thank you for inviting us to Vermont in a virtual way. We support you in your work. We congratulate you for all the great things that are happening in Vermont. And we, at the same time, challenge you to use your superpower and ask the question about how are the children. And as you ask that question, the real question is, how is each child in Vermont doing? I think there's a real opportunity in your state. If you think about if you really think about the fact that your state does not have as many students of color, but your data looks the same as the rest of the country, there's a real opportunity to make a difference. And as I always say, will a child be able to say that you were their superhero and changed their life? And with that, I want to say thank you again to my colleagues in Vermont, and look forward to any questions that you might have. And as I close out, I will also just remind us that we're all in this together. We really are. As our nation changed in January, and quite frankly, March, when we all kind of saw schools closing, and then we saw this incredible uprising, if you will, around race. I think it presents an opportunity for all of us to do better, myself included. And I congratulate you on the work and challenge you at the same time. And also thank you for, it takes a commitment to be a school board member and a person in education. So next up will be these breakout sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Regina. We do have a number of questions, so
sorry.
I'll start reading them off to you. You were very focused, so that's good. So over the years, I've observed funding cuts in adult mental health, and in the past, there was almost a direct correlation with increased funding of for-profit prisons in Vermont. Do you care to comment or know anything about this?
Oh, do I? Absolutely. I absolutely know about it. And it's not just in Vermont. Ohio also had a similar situation. There is a correlation. There are a couple things that go on. Jails and prisons have been used as places to care for our mental ill in this country, unlike some others, and that's a big mistake. And as we think about allocating resources and what that means, we need to put more resources in supports. It kind of goes to that same conversation. If you have more school resource officers than you have counselors and school psychologists, that tells a big story. And so there definitely is a correlation, and there's research to support that. We in Maryland, for example, our state closed our mental health facilities, jails and prisons. Attendance, incarceration went way up.
Okay. Do you know how Vermont scores on having restorative justice programs?
That's a good question. I need to do a little bit more research on that. And what I would say to you is that I did not get the sense in my research that these programs were a part of the fabric, if you will, in Vermont. And not only that, the teacher training piece of it is woefully lacking. It's sort of maybe an individual teacher might know something about it and try to implement it, and that's not the way to implement restorative justice.
I'm going to chime in quickly on that one also.
Sure.
I'll speak with some of you in the next session, but I come from a restorative justice background as well. And what I would say, not knowing the specific numbers, is that you start to have those conversations and think about them. Think about what you're actually scoring and evaluating on. Often the first place that we jump to, and rightfully so, is looking at suspension numbers. But that can definitely have an adverse impact on schools feeling like it's one or the other. And yes, we're doing this just to cut down our suspension numbers, where the root of restorative justice, as Regina mentioned in her presentation, it goes far beyond that in terms of just developing and fostering a sense of community. So looking at things like school connectedness, sense of welcoming, how many relationships they have with teachers, with staff, and those kind of things. A lot of those SEL components really go a long way in really understanding how a program's implemented, instead of school just saying, well, we did a circle and we didn't suspend kids, so our numbers look great. So I'll just give that little disclaimer. Back to you, Regina. As we reopen and think about equity, what would you recommend as first baby steps we should take?
Look at your data, of course, and look at the budget. I think a work session on how you're allocating resources is one of the first steps you need to take, because if you're not intentionally allocating them, you're not going to be able to do that. And that requires you to look at your data again, some of what I've shared today, but delve deep in your own districts so that you have an understanding of which students are struggling the most. And as hard as it might be, direct the resources that way.
Okay. What can we as school board members do to ensure our needier students are getting high quality educators? I particularly worry about IEP and 504 students who often spend much of their day with aides.
Yeah, so I looked at your union data, naturally for me to do, and I'll say it in this way. You have to, working with the superintendent, obviously you have to have a conversation about where teachers are placed, and also not just where they're placed, but what sort of mentoring program, peer mentoring programs do you have? What opportunities do you have for teachers to be elevated within their craft but stay in the classroom? And so that access has to look at teachers who are more experienced, who have already honed their craft, are more likely to be able to support students who have the greatest need. And districts have to make that tough choice and give teachers that option to be in those classrooms that are most needed. And there's more to that. There's a lot more to go to that conversation. So for example, also that there's a couple of programs that we've looked at, and we'll have to send them as a follow-up, essentially that helps navigate just how to work with teachers in these kinds of choices that might be difficult. You have to have some peer collaboration in that as well.
Okay, I'm not sure specifically what this was in response to, but a question about board input. So are you saying that boards have input into the opening policies and procedures?
So I'm saying boards have absolute input in policy. And of course, the day-to-day, the superintendent is to sort of map out what that looks like. But here's one of the really key things that boards miss. When you develop your policy, build into the policy the accountability piece. So how are you getting reported? How are you getting reports on it? Districts, I recommend often to have a data dashboard that helps boards to navigate that, and also do your agendas should be built around your policies. So in terms of how they're mapped out, you can do that by, as I said, putting the accountability piece within the policy, and that sort of puts the superintendent and his or her team in the mode that they have to present on these issues. And then again, when it comes back to budget, if your policy vision and the things that you have put out there are not, if the data isn't showing improvement in those areas, then you need to be asking those, trust but verify, but you need to ask those tough questions about why not.
Can you close the achievement gap without dealing with poverty? What should we do?
Yeah, you can. You absolutely can. And let me, in one quick way, I think you'll hear more about this too in Leah's session. One way to start doing that, the achievement gap puts the focus on children and blames them, but opportunity and access gaps focuses on adults and what we should be doing to provide opportunity and access. So we can change it. We have to shift our thinking, and we have to look at equity. We have to look at what are the needs, and when we make needs-based decisions, the outcomes are going to happen. Children surprise us all the time. They will rise to the occasion, but we have to give them the environment to do it. And oftentimes we hear, schools can't be everything. You're right, schools can't be everything, but schools need to be what children need them to be. And so to that extent, it also it challenges us to do what I was saying about sort of take away the sort of traditional notions of how we teach and what we're thinking about. So it's changed the traditional notions. That one best system has not worked for all children. Schools, and keep this in mind too, do a history lesson. Really walk through the history of your state. That's one of the things, when we're on the ground, we walk through your history in your state. And trust me when I tell you, the root cause analysis in every situation will get you to what you need to know in terms of how do you change the trajectory, if you will, of how it's going. I'm gonna sort of rely on our colleagues in Vermont. Can we take a couple more questions? It looks like I have maybe 1 minute. No. Susan.
I was actually just asking Dave the same question. We'll have 15 minutes to transition to the next meetings, which are all going to be in different video rooms. And so in the interest of making sure everybody can get where they need to be, I'd say let's take 2 more questions.
Okay, sure. Go for it, Adam. I couldn't see the question, so I'm sorry. I just assumed we didn't have any. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Adam.
Okay. How could school choice affect systemic racism?
Wow, that's a loaded question for 2 minutes, but or for 2 more questions. It depends on your community. So I'm going to start with that. It depends on your community. There isn't one thing that's going to impact systemic racism. What's going to impact systemic racism is, again, understanding history and willingness to shift our thinking, and then also understanding that things like redlining, it goes deep. Just how communities are built is what impacts it. Now, in terms of school choice, there are districts across the country who have tried it in urban areas, have tried it and still have some issues around that. So school choice alone, in and of itself, is not the answer. Again, it goes back to how you intentionally allocate your resources. Go ahead, Adam.
Okay, so last one, we'll stick with systemic racism. How would you advise a board in a district that has relied heavily on a longtime superintendent who may be concerned with preserving their professional legacy and therefore resistant to fully acknowledging and addressing systemic inequality in our schools? Oh, just cut out on me, I'm sorry. Hold on, I'm sorry.
Was that the end of the question, Adam?
That was half the question.
Oh, okay.
My question box just cut out. So I think I lost that question. You want to answer that part of it?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna look. I'm the outsider here, and you brought me in to have a conversation about equity. If governance teams can't do this if the superintendent and board aren't together on this conversation. So the board is responsible for setting vision and mission and accountability for the district. And if you have a situation where the data is telling you that systemic racism exists in your school district, in your system, and you need to make those changes, which you do, then you need to make choices about who's leading that work. And sometimes that just means it's a hard conversations, but the reason why these conversations need to happen is because sometimes people need to lead the room. Sometimes you need a leader that's willing to have the courageous conversations and have the raw courage to jump out there. Because at the end of the day, it's not about that long-serving superintendent. It is about each child. Ask that question in every board meeting. How are the children? And if you can't answer that in a way that supports and suggests that they are all doing fine, there's a lot more work to do. Thank you.
Regina, we want to thank you. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your message, and thank you for your wisdom. And we're glad that you're going to be with us a little bit longer as we go into the breakout session. So, excuse me, we are grateful. As Susan mentioned, we will be taking a short break now. During that time, please take a look at your virtual agenda for the information about how to access the breakout session that you have chosen to attend. If you have not selected a session, please do so now. Also note that breakouts 2 and 3 do have limits of 100 participants. We don't anticipate reaching that capacity, but if we do, please join whatever your second choice session is. Today's program will end following those breakout sessions, and we look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow morning at 8:30. And once again, to Regina and to all of our participants, thank you and have a great break.